I stare at the garden beds I've spent months nurturing. My hands are trembling, not from fear, but from pure, unfiltered rage. 20 years I spent protecting and serving this community as an officer. 20 years of restraint, of following rules, of keeping my cool when others lost theirs. This crosses every line. I can't take it anymore. Every day, I watch through my window as she sneaks into my yard, thinking I don't see her, taking what isn't hers, what I've worked for, what I've built with my own 2 hands since retirement. Well, Miss Peterson, I've got news for you. After today, you're going to regret ever setting foot on my property. I promise you that. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories of sweet revenge against entitled neighbors, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. My name is Marcus Johnson. After serving 20 years on the force in Chicago, I'd seen enough. Enough violence, enough hatred, enough of the worst humanity had to offer. I took my pension and bought a modest house in a quiet suburb outside of Atlanta, a place where I could breathe again, where I could heal. The house wasn't much, a small 3-bedroom with fading paint and creaking floorboards, but it had one feature that sold me immediately: a large backyard with perfect southern exposure. I'd always dreamed of having a garden. Something about nurturing life from seed to harvest spoke to me after so many years of dealing with death and destruction. So the day after I moved in, I started breaking ground, tilling the soil, testing the pH, adding compost and fertilizer. My neighbors would wave as they passed by, curious about the new guy spending hours in the dirt. Most were friendly, most but not all. Karen Peterson lived in the large colonial-style house next door. The first time we met, she didn't even look me in the eye, just pursed her lips and asked if I was the new gardener. When I explained I was the homeowner, she muttered something about property values and walked away. I didn't think much of it at the time. In my years as an officer, I'd encountered all types. Some people just needed time to warm up. By late spring, my garden was thriving. Rows of tomatoes, bell peppers, cucumbers, zucchini, and a variety of herbs stretched across my backyard. I'd installed raised beds, a proper irrigation system, and even built a small greenhouse for starting seedlings. It wasn't just a hobby, it had become my therapy, my way of reintroducing myself to a world that didn't involve crime scenes and interrogation rooms. Then things started disappearing. It began with a few tomatoes. I noticed gaps in the vines where ripe fruit should have been. At first, I blamed animals, maybe rabbits or squirrels getting past my fencing. But when I found neat cuts where vegetables had been harvested with a tool rather than torn off by animal teeth, I knew better. I installed a simple security camera disguised as a birdhouse, pointing it toward my prized garden beds. The next morning, I reviewed the footage and felt my blood pressure spike. There she was, Karen Peterson, designer gardening gloves and wicker basket in hand, calmly walking through my garden at 5:30 a.m., selecting the best produce as if she were shopping at a farmer's market. I decided to approach this reasonably. After all, I'd spent my career de-escalating situations. That afternoon, I knocked on her door, smiled politely, and broached the subject. "Miss Peterson, I noticed you were in my garden this morning. I put a lot of work into growing those vegetables, and I'd appreciate if you'd ask before taking anything." She blinked at me, her face a mask of practiced innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about. I have it on camera, ma'am." Her expression hardened. "Well, your garden is an eyesore. The Homeowners Association has standards, you know. If I have to look at that mess from my window, I might as well benefit from it. There is no HOA in this neighborhood, Miss Peterson, and even if there were, it wouldn't give you the right to take what isn't yours." She sniffed dismissively. "Those vegetables were going to waste, and it's not like you can eat all of them yourself." I took a deep breath. "That's not the point. It's my property, and those are my vegetables. Please stay out of my garden." She shut the door in my face. The next day, 2 of my cucumber plants had been trampled. The day after that, someone had pulled up an entire row of my herb garden. No footage this time. She'd apparently spotted the camera and avoided its view. But I knew, and the message was clear. She wasn't going to stop. I reported the trespassing and vandalism to the local police. They sent an officer, took a report, and promised to keep an eye on the situation. But I'd been a cop long enough to know where this fell on their priority list. Without evidence of significant property damage, they had bigger problems to handle. For 3 weeks, the pattern continued. I'd plant, she'd steal. I'd set up new cameras, she'd find ways around them. I built a higher fence and somehow she'd still get in. It was becoming an obsession for both of us, me trying to protect my garden, her seemingly determined to provoke me. Then came the farmer's market incident. I'd harvested my best produce early that Saturday morning and rented a small booth at the local farmer's market. It wasn't about making money. It was about sharing my passion with the community, maybe making some new friends. I'd arranged my vegetables carefully, put up a small sign, "Johnson Family Garden Grown with Love." I stepped away for just a moment to help an elderly woman carry her purchases to her car. When I returned, I froze. There was Karen standing at my booth, talking animatedly to a group of people. "Yes, these are all from my garden. I've been growing organically for years. My secret is in the soil composition and daily care." She was selling MY vegetables, claiming they were hers, the produce I'd nurtured from seed, the literal fruits of my labor. Something in me snapped. Not visibly, years of police training had taught me to keep my emotions in check. But inside, a line had been crossed. I approached calmly, tapped her on the shoulder. "Excuse me, Miss Peterson, but these vegetables are from my garden." The people gathered around looked confused. Karen's face flushed. "This is my neighbor," she said quickly to the crowd. "He's confused. We share a garden plot." "No, we don't," I replied evenly. "These are from my garden, the garden you've been stealing from for weeks." One woman in the group frowned. "Karen, you told me you grew all your own produce." "I do," Karen insisted. I pulled out my phone, showed them photos of my garden, of me working in it. "Notice the house in the background? That's mine, not hers." The crowd began to disperse, murmuring uncomfortably. Karen's face contorted with rage. She leaned in close, her voice a venomous whisper. "You'll regret this. Nobody embarrasses me and gets away with it." She stormed off, leaving me with my vegetables and a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. That night, I returned home to find my garden destroyed. Not just harvested, destroyed. Plants uprooted, tomato cages smashed, irrigation lines cut. The small greenhouse had been knocked over, seedlings strewn across the ground. I stood there in the fading light, surveying the devastation, feeling a familiar hollowness in my chest. The same emptiness I'd felt at crime scenes where senseless destruction had occurred. But this time it was personal. This was my sanctuary, my healing place. I called the police again. The same officer responded, took more photos, wrote another report. He looked genuinely sympathetic. "You know who did this?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "but I can't prove it." He nodded, understanding the frustration of knowing versus proving. "Security cameras? She avoided them, or disabled them. She's determined." The officer sighed. "Nuck, I'll increase patrols in your area, but..." "I know," I said. "Not much else you can do." After he left, I sat on my back porch steps, staring at the wreckage of months of work. Something inside me hardened. I'd spent a career upholding the law, playing by the rules. Where had it gotten me? I was the victim here, yet I was the one suffering while Karen Peterson faced no consequences. The next morning, I went to the hardware store. I bought new seedlings, new soil, new equipment. But I also bought something else: permanent fabric dye, the kind used for clothing that never washes out. I chose the brightest, most garish colors they had: neon green, electric blue, vibrant purple. At home, I began the process of rebuilding my garden. I replanted, reconstructed, reimagined. But this time, I added something special. Using food-grade silicone and incredible patience, I crafted perfect replicas of right vegetables: tomatoes, zucchinis, bell peppers. They looked authentic from a distance but were actually hollow silicone shells filled with permanent dye rigged to burst upon harvesting. I planted these special vegetables among my real ones, positioning them to be the most tempting targets, the most colorful tomato on the vine, the most perfectly shaped cucumber. Then I repaired my security cameras, adding new ones with better angles, and waited. 3 days passed. I continued tending my garden, but no sign of Karen. Perhaps she thought she'd won, that she'd broken me. On the 4th day, I deliberately left the house just after dawn, making sure to start my car and drive away visibly. But instead of going far, I parked around the corner and walked back, entering through my rear basement door where I had a perfect view of the garden from a small window. I didn't have to wait long. Less than 20 minutes after I left, Karen appeared at the edge of my property, glancing around furtively before approaching my garden beds with pruning shears and her signature wicker basket. She was smiling to herself, triumphant, as she assessed the rebuilt garden. She reached for a particularly beautiful heirloom-looking tomato, one of my special creations. I held my breath as her fingers closed around it, as she snipped it from the vine, as she placed it in her basket. Nothing happened yet. The dye packets were designed to rupture when squeezed or cut open. She moved on, selecting a perfect-looking zucchini, also fake, 2 bell peppers, real ones. I wasn't going to booby-trap all my actual produce. And then another special tomato. Her basket nearly full. She turned to leave. That's when she made the critical mistake. She picked up one of my fake cucumbers, admired it, and gave it a squeeze to test its ripeness. The cucumber burst in her hand, spraying neon green dye all over her fingers, arms, and designer gardening outfit. She yelped in shock, dropping the basket. The fake tomatoes tumbled out, and when they hit the ground, they too exploded, splattering red and purple dye across her legs and feet. Karen stood there frozen, staring at her now multicolored hands in horror. Then, in a panic, she tried to wipe the dye off on her clothes, only spreading it further. She grabbed a real tomato from her basket and squeezed it, apparently thinking she could use the juice to clean herself. This just added actual tomato pulp to the colorful mess. By now, she was frantically looking around, probably worried about being caught. She hurried back toward her house, leaving a trail of multicolored footprints across my lawn and hers. I waited until she was gone, then went upstairs and called the police. When the same officer arrived, I showed him the security footage. She was trespassing again, I said, stealing from my garden after already vandalizing it once. The officer watched the footage, his face impassive until Karen squeezed the fake cucumber. Then he couldn't help but chuckle. What exactly was in those vegetables, sir? Permanent fabric dye, I replied innocently. I've been experimenting with growing plants for natural dyes. Some of my experiments didn't work out. The plants look normal but contain concentrated dye instead of being edible. I was planning to dispose of them properly, but unfortunately, Ms. Peterson took them before I could. The officer looked at me for a long moment. I kept my expression neutral, professional. Finally, he nodded slowly. I see. Well, we have clear evidence of trespassing and theft now. I'll pay Ms. Peterson a visit. I thanked him and went about my day, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Later that afternoon, I was working in my front yard when a police car pulled up to Karen's house. The officer who'd taken my reports went to her door and knocked. For a long time, there was no answer. Finally, the door opened just a crack. Even from where I stood, I could see the brilliant splotches of color on Karen's face and hands. The officer spoke with her briefly, then returned to his car and made a call. 20 minutes later, another police car arrived. This time, Karen was escorted out, still multicolored, still in her stained clothes, and placed in the back of the patrol car. My officer friend walked over to where I was pretending to be absorbed in pruning my front hedges. Ms. Peterson has been engaged in a pattern of trespassing and theft across the neighborhood, he said. Not just your garden, but several others. She's also been selling the stolen produce at multiple farmers markets, claiming it's organic and homegrown. I raised my eyebrows, genuinely surprised. She's been doing this to others too? For months, apparently. Nobody wanted to report it because she's on the city council and heads the neighborhood beautification committee. He glanced back at the patrol car. Hard to maintain that pristine image now, though. What's going to happen to her? Asked. Multiple counts of trespassing, theft, vandalism, and fraud for selling stolen goods. Probably won't see jail time, but there'll be fines, community service, and a lot of embarrassment. He paused. Those dyes really won't wash out? I shook my head. Not for at least 6 months. Maybe longer. He nodded, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. Well, Mr. Johnson, thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. I think we've got everything we need from you. As he walked away, my next-door neighbor on the other side, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chun who I'd helped with her groceries a few times, came over to me. I saw what happened, she said quietly. That woman took 3 of my prize-winning roses last month, cut them right from my garden while I was at my sister's. She patted my arm. Your garden will be safe now. We all will. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By evening, I had a steady stream of visitors, neighbors bringing dishes, introducing themselves, sharing their own Karen Peterson stories. Many of them had been victims of her entitlement but had been too intimidated to speak up. One neighbor, a young man named David, shook my hand vigorously. My partner and I tried to start a vegetable garden last year, but stuff kept disappearing. We thought we were going crazy. Eventually, we just gave up. You should start again, I told him. I've got some seedlings I can share. By sunset, what had started as awkward visits had evolved into an impromptu block party on my front lawn. Someone brought a grill, someone else brought drinks. People were exchanging phone numbers, making plans for a community garden, laughing together. As I looked around at my new community, I realized something important. In all my years as a police officer, I've seen the worst of humanity, the violence, the cruelty, the indifference. I'd forgotten that for every Karen Peterson in the world, there were dozens of good people just looking for connection, for community. Karen Peterson did ultimately face consequences. The local newspaper ran a story about her scheme, complete with a photo of her multicolored face taken at the police station. She was forced to resign from the city council. The farmers' markets banned her from selling. She paid fines and did community service. Ironically, much of it landscaping work in public parks. The dye eventually faded, but her reputation never recovered. 6 months later, she put her house on the market and moved away. As for me, my garden flourished that summer and into fall. I shared my harvest with neighbors, taught gardening classes at the community center, and even started a program bringing troubled youth to work in the soil, finding the same healing I had found. Sometimes, when I'm working in my garden in the early morning light, I think about Karen Peterson and those dye-filled vegetables. I don't regret what I did. It exposed a woman who was taking advantage of an entire community. But I do regret that it came to that. In an ideal world, we would respect each other's boundaries, each other's labor, each other's passions. But we don't live in an ideal world. Sometimes you have to draw a line. Sometimes you have to show people that actions have consequences. And sometimes those consequences come in bright, permanent colors that no amount of scrubbing can remove. My name is Marcus Johnson. I protected my community for 20 years with a badge. Now I protect it with a garden. And I sleep better at night knowing both jobs matter. The community garden bloomed the following spring, taking up a previously abandoned lot at the end of our street. Everyone contributed tools, seeds, knowledge, time. Mrs. Chun taught us all about companion planting techniques her family had used for generations. David and his partner specialized in rare heirloom varieties. Children from the neighborhood would come after school, excited to see what had grown since their last visit. I found myself becoming something of a neighborhood fixture, the retired cop with the green thumb. People would bring me their gardening questions, their plant problems, sometimes their personal problems too. There's something about working side by side in the soil that encourages conversation, that breaks down barriers. About a year after the Karen incident, as neighbors now jokingly called it, a new family moved into her old house. They approached the community garden cautiously at first, not sure if they would be welcome. The father, Michael, explained they'd gotten a steep discount on the house, but weren't sure why until a real estate agent from a different company had mentioned the dye lady. We all laughed and welcomed them immediately. Their 2 young children were assigned their own small plot in the garden where they could grow whatever they wanted. Their daughter chose strawberries. Their son wanted pumpkins, as big as my head. Michael's wife, Amara, turned out to be a botanist, and soon she was helping us experiment with new varieties suited to our specific climate. Sometimes life has a way of bringing balance, I thought. Where Karen had sowed discord and entitlement, this new family was cultivating community and generosity. One afternoon, as I was demonstrating proper tomato staking techniques to a group of neighborhood kids, a sleek black SUV pulled up beside the community garden. A woman stepped out, expensive sunglasses, designer clothes, an air of authority. For a moment, my stomach tightened. Something about her demeanor reminded me of Karen. She approached our group, removed her sunglasses, and introduced herself as Alexandra Williams, a producer for a national gardening show. They were doing a special episode on community gardens that revitalize neighborhoods, and ours had been recommended. "We heard there's quite a story behind this garden," she said, glancing around appreciatively at our thriving plots. "Something about a neighborhood dispute and some creative justice involving dye?" The children giggled, already familiar with the infamous tale. I cleared my throat, suddenly uncomfortable with the idea of national exposure. "It's a long story," I hedged. Mrs. Chun had no such reservations. "This man is our hero," she announced, patting my arm. He stood up to a bully when no one else would. Alexandra's eyes lit up. "That's exactly the kind of human interest angle we're looking for. Would you be willing to tell your story on camera? We'd also feature the garden, of course, and the community you've built." Before I could respond, the children were jumping up and down with excitement, and neighbors were emerging from their plots, eager to be part of a TV show. I looked around at their enthusiastic faces and realized that this wasn't just my story anymore. It belonged to all of us. "On one condition," I said to Alexandra. "This can't just be about revenge or public shaming. It has to be about what came after, how this community came together, how we turned something negative into something positive." She smiled. "That's exactly the story we want to tell." The segment aired 2 months later. They titled it "From Conflict to Community: How One Man's Garden Justice Grew a Neighborhood." It was a hit, drawing attention from gardening enthusiasts and community organizers nationwide. Soon, we were receiving emails and letters from people starting their own community gardens, asking for advice or sharing their own stories of neighborhood transformation. Local businesses took notice too. The hardware store started donating tools and supplies. A nearby nursery offered discounted seedlings. The city council, minus Karen Peterson, of course, approved a grant for us to expand into 2 more vacant lots. We used the money to build a proper greenhouse, install rainwater collection systems, and create a small produce stand where neighbors could exchange vegetables or sell their excess. We operated on an honor system: take what you need, leave what you can, and to everyone's surprise, it worked. In a world where I'd seen so much dishonesty, this small token of community trust restored something in me. That fall, we hosted our first harvest festival. Tables loaded with food stretched down the block, dishes made from our garden produce, representing the diverse cultures of our neighborhood. Korean kimchi using our cabbages sat next to Italian tomato sauce, Mexican salsa, Southern collard greens, and Indian chutneys. As I looked around at the faces, children running between tables, teens proudly serving dishes they'd helped prepare, adults engaged in conversation across differences that would have seemed insurmountable before our garden, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, even for Karen Peterson, whose actions had inadvertently sparked all of this. David approached me with a glass of homemade lemonade. "You're looking philosophical," he observed. I chuckled, just thinking about how something that started with permanent dye and petty revenge ended up creating all this. He nodded. "It's like gardening itself, isn't it? You never really know what will grow from the seeds you plant." That winter, I received a letter with an unfamiliar postmark. Inside was a brief note on plain stationery. "Mr. Johnson, I saw you on that gardening show. For what it's worth, I'm sorry for what I did to your garden and the other gardens in the neighborhood. I was going through a difficult time in my life, though that's no excuse. Seeing what you've built from that conflict made me reflect on my own choices. I'm trying to be better. Tapey. There was no return address. I stood there in my kitchen, turning the letter over in my hands, unsure how to feel. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as too little, too late. Another part recognized the difficulty of such an admission, however brief. I tucked the letter into a drawer, neither forgetting it nor dwelling on it. People are complicated. I'd learned that as a police officer, and I was learning it again as a gardener and community organizer. We're all capable of destruction and creation, selfishness and generosity. Sometimes we need to see the consequences of our actions reflected back at us, whether in multicolored dye or in a thriving community garden, to understand our impact on others. 3 years have passed since that first confrontation with Karen Peterson. Our community garden project has expanded to include an educational program for schools, cooking classes using garden produce, and a small farmers market of our own. I've published a modest gardening book sharing my experiences, with proceeds going back into community projects. Sometimes, visitors to our garden ask about the famous dye incident. The story has become something of a neighborhood legend, growing more colorful, pun intended, with each retelling. The children, especially, love to act it out, one playing Karen, another playing me, others playing the